Being a parent, it's no easy feat. Being a parent in this technology-obsessed day and age seems like it should make things easier, but that's not always the case. Joining us to discuss this is Molly McHugh from The Ringer. How's it going, Molly?
Hey, guys. How are you?
Awesome. It's great to have you back. You wrote how we are life logging everything thanks to technology, which is so very true. What are some of the risks inherent with capturing and managing this kind of data when it comes to our children? I feel like I struggle with this. As a parent, I struggle with this. I don't know how involved with technology I'm supposed to be. What do you think?
So I started getting interested in this when I was talking to my friends who are having kids now and looking at all of the very different things available to them. And it seems so overwhelming. Being a parent seems really hard, just picking out their clothes. And then you have to talk about well, what data tracker should I get? And so I started talking to some experts about it, and there's a lot of risks. I mean, there's the risk of being too obsessed with your kids. There's the risk of being so into the technology that you are actually paying more attention to the data than your child. So it can cause a disconnect. It can cause lack of trust as they grow up. It's just not a thing we think about because, when I was growing up, nobody was monitoring me that closely. So I don't know what that's like. And these kids will know exactly what it's like to be watched from birth, potentially.
Yeah, it's like when we were growing up, parents, more or less, parents always have the child's best interest at heart, let's say, and want to keep the kids safe and that sort of stuff. When we were growing up, our parents were no different in that regard. It's just now we have access to the ability to track every minute detail, to have live streaming, cameras of our home when we're away so we can still keep tabs on them. I guess the big question is what kind of long-term effects this has. Is that a question that we can even answer at this point? Because it feels so modern. It feels so fresh.
We can start to talk about it. And that's kind of what I was trying to do is ask, what are all these kids who are going to be monitored from, maybe even before they were born? What are they going to be like?
Right.
And some of the people I talked to said things like they are going to be more immature, a little more passive, less autonomous, perhaps, and have maybe some problems trusting people who are older than them because they're just used to being watched. So all of that seems really bad. And then at the same time, you're going to have parents who catch illnesses in their children before they knew what was actually going on, or they're able to identify sleep problems, or maybe kids who have special needs are able to use technology to communicate better. So, with everything, we have a lot of benefits too. It's just interesting that it's just ourselves we're messing up potentially, or we're taking on. And in this case, it's a whole nother generation.
Mm-hmm.
The rate at which it's changing, the speed at which things are changing is amazing. Just reading through your piece, you talk about how when you got in trouble because you got caught because you left behind a printout of Google Maps when you were going to sneak out somewhere, and an AIM chat window, which sounds old-fashioned.
Yeah, at least it wasn't MapQuest.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I know. My parents were great about participating in this article. I was definitely not a bad kid, but I did stupid stuff. And then I would leave my little, at the time, high-tech trail behind and get myself caught. Kids, the other thing I talked to some people about that didn't even make it into the article was kind of teenagers are always going to learn how to circumvent technology, and they'll get caught. But we always adapt. And I'm sure if I were a teenager today, it would have been harder to get away with some of the stuff I did. But I'm sure I would have found a way, which I am still very sorry to my parents for.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that in a lot of ways, I like to believe this as a parent of teenagers and tweenagers. I like to believe that nothing's changed. That a lot has changed, but really at the heart, nothing's changed. And what you're saying about, autonomy and trust, those are things that the parents have always wanted to instill in their children. And, we can look at the good as well that technology has brought. A lot of people talk about sexting, for example. You throw that term around and how damaging it could be to a girl to send a picture of herself and get it, get forwarded everywhere. And that's embarrassing and horrible. But if you think about in my parents' day or my grandparents' day, if something happened and they got pregnant, they had to marry that person and live the rest of their life, which is, more of a consequence. Right. So I think I like to believe that the more things change, the more they say the same. Am I fooling myself?
That's like a really positive view to take, and hopefully you're right. And I don't think it's the normal amount of tracking stuff. Like, I'm sure having Find My Friends on to see where your teenager is going is fine, versus like having some sort of chip implanted in your arm that starts tracking your child's breathing movements from the time of like conception, and then logging spreadsheets of everything for the rest of their lives. I think the extreme of this, which we have the potential to get into the more we get obsessed with quantified self, that is where we start to like maybe go off the deep end on changing how people grow up to a really weird place.
Yeah, that's been my concern as I have a almost 7-year-old and almost 4-year-old, and over the years just kind of realizing that yes, technology exists to make our lives easier, and yes, I know as they get older, I will be tempted to do these things that are convenient with technology, things like, tracking to make sure that they aren't going somewhere that they shouldn't be going to. But what kind of effect does that have on them as they develop to, into older, young adults or whatever, to be accepting of certain things that our generation and generations before are not? This like constant direct surveillance of everything you do, feeling like everything that you do is being watched and under a microscope. If they're exposed to that from a very young age, yes, it was convenient and maybe it was a tool as a parent, but what are the long-term ramifications? That's the kind of stuff that I really get concerned with.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to talk about how just raising kids it's really different than it used to be. You used to have a lot more people around you, and you were around kids as a much younger adult. So babies were not as scary and confusing, which I can totally relate to. My dad is one of 7, so he was around babies all the time. I didn't hold a baby until I was, in my teens probably. And I only have a few friends with kids. And so I'm not helping anybody raise their kids. And if I ever have kids, it's going to be this totally new thing. And I'm sure it's terrifying. And when people get scared, it's really nice to rely on a little app that tells you, your kid's fine and they're breathing and they're normal and their bed is monitoring them. So you don't worry. So I totally understand the motivation for doing it. But at the same time, yeah, it might not be so great for us. Maybe we should be communicating more, relying on people more, being closer to our families if we need help with our future generations of kids. But honestly, it's probably a combination of the two is the best way to do it, which it always is. It's just that we have a really hard time limiting ourselves when we get new fancy technology that tells us everything we could ever want to know.
For sure.
You also make some great points in your piece about what this kind of technology is doing to our memory, like, the life logging part of it, how many pictures we're taking and videos we're taking of our kids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I thought that wasn't even something I planned on talking about until I was talking to Dr. Harvey Karp, who he developed the swaddling method. So he's a baby expert. He can make any baby stop crying.
I bow down to Harvey. I learned many tricks from Harvey.
I think a lot of parents really admire him.
Yes.
But he has a smart bed called Snoo that uses sound and movement to rock a baby back to sleep. That uses basically what he did in real life in bed form. But he was talking to me about how this data is more than just like charts and graphs and numbers now. Like we see data and it actually triggers memories and nostalgia. And it's really precious to us, kind of in the way that pictures or videos become precious to us. And again, like I'm not a parent, so seeing like a graph of my baby's first steps, I don't know how exciting that is yet. Seeing a video seems really exciting, but that becomes really important. And you don't want to like begrudge anyone for feeling connected to that kind of data. You probably just don't want them to become too reliant on it. And it's like it is with everything, live in the moment a little bit more. But it is interesting how attached we are to some of this stuff, how some of these data charts about, what our bodies and other people's bodies are doing.
Yeah, once the technology becomes more important than like the human connection aspect of being a parent with a child, then I think you're treading into dangerous long-term territory, I would imagine. Yeah, I mean, we had a story was it from CES? I can't remember when it was, but it was one of those smart assistants that will read a bedtime story to your infant in their crib. Like it's meant to be like this companion / baby monitor next to your infant in their crib. And I'm like, okay, well, I get the reason behind it. I get why it exists and why someone thought, well, this is actually solving a problem that many parents have. I just get worried about like the long-term effects of if you are an infant and you start your life and develop throughout year after year having this like connection with a robot, let's say, versus having, overwhelmingly by comparison human connections, what that actually does. And I don't know, I think our kids need more human interaction, but maybe I'm old-fashioned.
That was a huge trend at CES, was like the Google Home for kids. There were so many of them that were like, it will read your kid a bedtime story or help train them to sleep. Or you can record things like don't forget your backpack and all this stuff. And I thought it was a little weird, to be sure. I see the use in it. I mean, it's kind of like using that big family calendar we all had to check our schedules when I was a kid,
right?
But much more high tech. And then you start getting into like, well, when we're too dependent on it, you have like a weird robot nanny raising your kids, right? Like, we're really close to that being what that is.
Yeah. The Jetsons. It's the future.
Right.